Welcome to today's lesson on the Italian game, one of the oldest and most classical chess openings. The game begins with pawn to the e4, pawn to the e5, knight to the f3, knight to the c6, bishop to the c4, and bishop to c5. White then plays knight to the c3, followed by black developing knight to the f6. So far, everything looks like normal development pawn to d3, pawn to d6, without anything unusual. Now white plays bishop to the g5. Black usually assumes that white's idea is to pin the knight on f6 to the queen, and therefore to build pressure against this knight. To stop this, black very often pushes pawn to the h6, trying to force the bishop away. Black expects white to retreat bishop to the h4, maintaining the pin. Instead, white changes the plan and immediately captures the knight on the f6 with the bishop. Black often feels comfortable here, believing the pin has been removed, but then white continues with knight to the d5, creating a powerful double threat, attacking both the pawn on the c7 and the queen on the f6. The only move that defends both threats is for black to retreat queen back to the d8. White then calmly plays pawn to the c3, seemingly just strengthening central control. At this point, black often develops with bishop to the e6, which looks natural but is actually a serious mistake. White responds with pawn to the d4, striking at the center and attacking three minor pieces at once. This move forces black into trouble, and one of their pieces is very likely to be lost. For example, if black trades pawns on the d4, white recaptures, and the bishop on the a6 remains under attack. If black retreats bishop to the b6, white exchanges and then pushes pawn to the d5, creating a fork that simultaneously attacks the bishop and the knight. Black must lose material. Alternatively, if black decides to capture the pawn on d5 instead of retreating the bishop, white recaptures with the pawn. And once again, this pawn creates a double attack against two minor pieces, ensuring material gain. Sometimes black may try to complicate matters with bishop to the b4, checking the white king. But this also fails. After white moves the king away from check, if black shifts the knight, white has the strong reply queen to the a4, delivering a double attack against both the king and the bishop. The result is again a loss of material for black. Therefore, white wins the bishop on the following move. Now let us go back to the starting position of this forced line. We have already seen that retreating the bishop to the b6 does not work, and capturing on the d5 also fails. So, what if black tries bishop to the b4, hoping to escape this way? In that case, white captures the bishop on the b4. Now black once again faces two unpleasant choices. If black recaptures on the b4, they run into the familiar problem. Queen to the a4 square with check, delivering a double attack to the king and the knight, winning material. On the other hand, if black tries retreating the knight back to the c6, white plays the strong move pawn to the d5. This creates another fork, as the pawn attacks both the bishop and the knight, ensuring that one of them will be lost. The final possibility we need to analyze is when black plays bishop to the b4 with check, white captures the bishop with knight, and instead of recapturing on the b4 with knight, black chooses to capture the bishop on the c4 with their bishop. Even this does not solve black's problems. After white exchanges on the c6, the follow-up queen to the c2 places strong pressure along the c-file against both the bishop and the pawn. The pawn cannot be safely defended. If it retreats, white simply captures it for free. The best practical chance for black here is to give up this pawn and continue playing from a worse position. However, if black stubbornly tries to hold on to the pawn with bishop to the b5, white immediately answers with pawn to the a4, driving the bishop away. After bishop to the a6 square, black not only loses the pawn anyway, but also faces another double attack, creating with queen to c6, this time against both the bishop and the king, leaving white to win the bishop on the very next move. This line is a truly clever opening trap. It requires no strange or suspicious moves from white, and black's replies all appear completely natural. Because of this, many opponents will fall into it, and you are guaranteed to score several quick wins by following this idea. The next opening trap in the Italian game starts with pawn to the e4, pawn to the e5, knight to the f3, knight to the c6, bishop to the c4, and bishop to the c5. White castles, and black develops with knight to the f6. White plays pawn to the d3, and black answers with pawn to the d6 square. Now white often tries bishop to the g5, a move many players like, though here it is not so effective. Black pushes pawn to the h6 square. Unlike in the earlier trap where white had a knight on the c3 square ready to jump to the d5, instead, if white king castle here, white has no such option, so this move is completely safe. If white retreats bishop to the h4, black continues pawn to the g5, then bishop to the g3, followed by pawn to the h5 square. Suddenly, black creates a strong kingside pawn storm and takes over the attack. The threat is clear. Pawn to the h4 will trap the bishop, which has no retreat. If white tries pawn to the h3 to resist, it only weakens the king. Black pushes pawn to the g4 square, and white pawn captures the g4 pawn. Then h5 takes white pawn on g4 after the exchanges. The rook on the h8 square controls the open h-file against the white king. With just the queen joining in, black can launch a deadly attack and even deliver checkmate. Black's attack doesn't usually strike instantly. It often requires a few preparatory moves, but once everything is in place, the assault can become extremely dangerous. Let's walk through a sharp example. Imagine white carelessly advances their knight to g5, perhaps hoping to stir up some pressure against black's kingside. At first glance, this seems aggressive, but black has a clever counter. By shifting the knight to h5, black achieves two things at once. The queen suddenly lines up against the g5 knight, and the h5 knight simultaneously threatens white's bishop on g3. This dual threat forces white to make a difficult choice. Suppose white miscalculates and decides to grab material by capturing on f7 with the knight, thinking they've launched a strong attack against black's rook in position. The surprise comes immediately. Black responds with knight takes g3. Now, things take a dramatic turn. White cannot simply recapture, because the g3 knight is tactically pinned by black's queen. If white goes ahead and captures black's queen, believing they've won a decisive advantage, they suddenly fall victim to the hidden trap. Black calmly plays rook to h1, and it's checkmate on the spot. The rook delivers the final blow from h8, supported by the unstoppable knight on g3. This sequence beautifully illustrates how black's patient buildup can lead to a devastating mating attack. What looked like white's initiative ends up backfiring completely, showing just how dangerous it can be to underestimate black's counterplay. White cannot simply defend with pawn to the h3 square, but in the actual game they chose to strike immediately with knight capturing on the f7, threatening the rook and the queen. Black calmly pushed pawn to the h4 square anyway, leaving the bishop with no retreat. White captured on the f7, thinking the attack on the rook and queen would give them momentum and material. But black ignored it and played pawn capturing bishop on the g3, a stunning queen sacrifice by white knight. Instead of immediately trying to regain material, black played the astonishing move bishop to the g4. At first it looks unthinkable, but the idea is clear. The white king is dangerously exposed. The bishop and rook on the h-file, combined with the pawn on the g3, already create tremendous pressure. The only thing missing is one more piece in the attack to finish the checkmate. That is why black calmly develops bishop to the g4, also targeting the queen. White responded with queen to the d2, but then black continued even more quietly with knight to the d4. This move not only brings yet another attacker, but also creates a direct threat. Knight to the e2 with check, followed by rook to the h2 delivering checkmate. If you can visualize this line, it becomes clear how powerful black's attack is. On the next move, black had a prepared continuation. White thought they could simply develop with knight to the c3, covering key squares and stabilizing the position. But black ignored this, and instead black played knight to the f3, sacrificing the knight by white pawn. Then bishop takes white pawn. After this exchange, white suddenly has no defense against the stunning checkmate. Pawn captures on the h2, delivering checkmate. This is completely unexpected, and the white player must have been shocked by the sequence. If white tries to capture the pawn on g3 with their own pawn, black finishes with rook to the h1, delivering checkmate. This is an extraordinary line, a perfect example of a tactical trap and a useful idea to remember for your own games. Thanks for watching.